Bismillah. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizer for inviting me and for taking interest in my work. I would also like to thank everyone who has made this conference possible. The conference is discussing an exceptionally important topic, and I hope that some of that my presentation is going to contribute meaningfully to the discussion, and I look forward to learning from the audience and my esteemed co-panelists as well. I'm going to restrict myself to, because I only have 20 minutes, I am going to read from my script, and I have timed myself, so it's just under 20 minutes. So if I could have my first slide, please. The title of my topic is Islam and the Religious Other. No, the first slide, please. Some reflections on the nature of this relationship in early Islam and beyond. Obviously, this is a topic that many scholars who are much more erudite than me have written on. I hope to present some of the most important lessons and findings that leading scholars in this area have shared with us. So if I could have the next slide, please. My basic aim is to outline and describe certain significant factors and the context that has affected and continues to affect the relationship between Islam or the Muslim self and the religious other. Next slide, please. So how do the normative fountainheads of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, approach the relationship between the Muslim self and the religious other? To begin to answer this question, more needs to be said about the revelatory environment in which the Quranic revelation and the Prophet of Islam's embodiment of it took place, as it relates to the question of Muslim confessional identity and that of the religious other. My emphasis on context is based on the fundamental consideration that even a cursory examination of the nature of the Quran as revelation and its content, and therefore also the legacy of Prophet of Islam, what I'm trying to say is that for us to understand the relationship between the Muslim self and the religious other, we need to understand the context, and this context is reflected in the content of the Quran itself. Yeah? But also, we need to look beyond the scripture and look at how various Muslim communities in history have also tried to answer this question and embody this question and reflect it in their day-to-day lives. Professor Zeev Magen, a noted scholar of the nature of the interactions between Muslim and non-Muslims in early Islam, described the context and the dynamics behind this relationship in the following manner, especially when it comes to how the Quran approaches the so-called Ahl al-Kitab communities, and I quote, Islam's relationship with the people of the book has had its ups and downs. The growing familiarity of the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula with the ideas, institutions, and communities of the surrounding monotheisms, followed by the initial and increasingly intense encounters of the nascent Muslim Ummah with the same, bred the complex mixture of attitudes to Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism discernible through the classical literature of the faith. The seminal texts and genres, the Quran, the Hadith, Tafsir, Sharh, and Fiqh, evince a multifaceted and pendulating posture vis-a-vis the religio-cultural other that partakes more of a dialectic than dogma. So basically, what Professor Magam is trying to say here is that when we look at early Islam, we see a multifaceted and dialectical relationship rather than a dogmatic one. Yeah. Additional scholars such as Johannes Friedman, Fred Donna, and Jacques Wadenburg have also written on this relationship in early Islam. And having reviewed the scholarship, I have deduced a number of general points that we need to take into consideration if we want to truly understand the relationship between the Muslim self and the religious other in early Islam. The first point that we need to take into consideration is that the context behind the emergence of Islam in the 7th century Hijaz is that it, of course, took place alongside already well-established religious communities, the most important of which were the pre-Arabian pre-Quranic beliefs, Judaism, Christianity, and what the Quran describes as the Hanifiyah. So the very fabric and the nature of the message embodied in the Quran clearly depicts many of the events and the attitudes of the Muslim community toward the non-Muslim other, and vice versa. So the first point, a plurality of religions at the time of revelation of the Quran itself. The second point is that the Quranic attitudes and the praxis of Muhammad towards the non-Muslim other is highly contextual in nature and therefore to some extent also ambivalent. For example, for the large part of the formative period of the Muslim community during the time in Medina, the climate of conflict, friction, and hostility prevailed among Muslims, Arab polytheists, and large Jewish tribes in particular, and some of the so-called munafiqun, or what the Quran refers to as religious hypocrites. And because of these certain dynamics, actually, for the vast majority of the prophets of Islam's life, Muslim community was constantly concerned about its sheer survival. So that's another thing that we need to keep in mind. Indeed, Professor Montgomery Watt, who is a noted scholar for a formative Islamic period, describes the circumstances and the motives behind the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims during this period in time in Medina, with specific reference to the Jewish community in the following manner, and I quote, "In Muhammad's first 2 years at Medina, the Jews were the most dangerous critics of his claim to be a prophet and the religious fervor of his followers, on which so much depended, was liable to be greatly reduced unless Jewish criticisms could be silenced and rendered impotent. Insofar as the Jewish community changed their attitude and ceased to be actively hostile, they were left unmolested." End of quote. So because there was this, during the formative period, during the time of the life of the Prophet of Islam, this context, there was a climate of distrust and conflict indeed of various degrees. This context also often expressed itself in a reactionary and antagonistic type of Muslim identity toward the religious other. This is well attested not only in the Quran itself, but also in the additional Islamic literature such as the Hadith and the Islamic jurisprudence. This has led to the development of certain ideas and certain religio-legal concepts such as al-wala wal-bara and tashabbuh bil-kufar that emphasize the distinctiveness of Muslims in relation to the religious other. In the modern context, Islamic fundamentalist and extremist groups have employed these concepts to not only distance themselves from whom they consider to be the unbelievers, that is the non-Muslims other, but also Muslims who are considered to have lapsed, or Muslims who have considered to have lost their faith, the murtadun. Yeah. So they use these concepts such as al-wala wal-bara and tashabbuh bil-kufar to create a clear delineation and distinction of what it means to be a Muslim and what it means to be a non-Muslim. However, there are certain proponents of Islamic moderation and progressive Islam are rethinking concepts such as al-wala wal-bara and tashabbuh bil-kufar by applying a contextualist and a historical lens to them, thereby either restricting the applicability of these concepts or problematizing their actual validity. Apart from the socio-political factors that I mentioned earlier on, religious ideas were also significant in understanding the nature of the Muslim self and the religious other relationship. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the Quranic incremental consolidation of Islamic religious identity is inextricably linked with that of the religious identity of others, most notably the Jewish communities and the Christian communities. There were aspects of religious identity continuity and commonality with other faiths in the Quran, but they are also intimately intertwined with those of the emergence and emphasis on the Muslim identity's originality and distinctiveness. Therefore, the religious aspects and the interactions between various religious communities in the Quranic milieu led to the genesis of the construction of religious identity of Muslims and played a very important role in it. For example, in his study on the question to what extent Prophet of Islam and the Quranic scripture emphasized confessional distinctiveness, Professor Fred Donner has argued quite convincingly that scripturally, that is based on the Quranic evidence alone and that of early Islam, the community of what Professor Donner believes, Donner terms the believers, the mu'mineen, seems to have been originally conceptualized independent of confessional identities, and that it was only later, apparently during the third quarter of the first century of the Islamic calendar, that is a full generation or more after the founding of Muhammad's community, that membership in the community of believers came to be seen as confessional identity in itself. In other words, Professor Fred Donner adduces substantial amount of evidence that it could be argued that Quranically, at least some Jewish and Christians can qualify as mu'mineen, as believers. Johannes Friedman, in his work, also detected a similar, what he calls an ancient layer in the Islamic tradition, during which the boundaries of the Muslim community had not been precisely delineated, and according to which, and I quote, the Jews and the Christians belonged to the community of Muhammad, end of quote. And that this ancient layer of tradition, and I quote, was in general more considerate towards the people of the book than which eventually became established as Islamic law, end of quote. Another trend significant in the historical development of the Muslim religious self vis-a-vis the religious other was the gradual, ever-growing religious self-consciousness of the Prophet of Islam and his early community. So while attempts to find common ground occurred more frequently during the earlier periods of Muhammad's life, later periods tend to increasingly stress confessional and self-conscious Muslim identity. This is as far as our evidence permits us to go, because there are lots of questions surrounding, of course, the dating of Muslim tradition in the first and the second centuries. And the final additional point to be considered when we think about the relationship between the Muslim self and the religious other in early Islam is this really curious concept that the Quran uses of Hanif, that also is, the Quran also describes as the Millat Ibrahim. Yeah? So Quran talks about this idea of this, let's say, religious predisposition or tendency, the Hanif, that is associated with Millat Ibrahim, the Abrahamic religious community. So Quran uses this belief system in a sense of a primordial Ua religion that is based on the belief in one true God, as embodied in the message of Abraham. Yeah? And it is considered as the universal belief system and as potentially the final evolution in Muhammad's attitude towards the religious self and the other. However, as noted by Wardenburg, it is not clear whether the Prophet of Islam himself identifies historical Islam as the only or merely as one possible realization of this primordial religion, the Hanifiyya. Next slide, please. So now I have outlined about 5 or 6 points that we need to take into consideration when we want to understand the relationship between the Muslim self and the religious other during the time of the Prophet of Islam, the Quran, and very early Muslim community. But if we look at beyond early Islam, we see that Islam became an empire of faith. So it was a theology of power. And many Muslims over time became a ruling elite. Yeah? And therefore, they were in position to determine what kind of relationship, what kind of relationship they wanted to develop vis-a-vis the religious other, what kind of nature that relationship would have. Yeah? And when we look at Islamic history, one could see that we have seen episodes of what we could call the ethic of pluralism, as well as an ethic of exclusivism. I would briefly like to just focus on the ethic of pluralism. I will probably not have time to define what I mean by ethical pluralism, as I'm already over time, but certain historians such as Hodgson, Ira Lapidus, have noted that we have had periods in Islamic history, such as the Fatimids Egypt, perhaps the Ottoman Turkey, and the Mughal India, where this ethic of pluralism, of course, keeping in mind the historical differences and the historical context of what is meant by pluralism in pre-modern societies, that we do see examples of this ethical pluralism existing in certain historical contexts. Yeah. One important initiative in contemporary times is the Marrakesh Declaration that tries to actually, in legal terms, delineate specific rights for non-Muslims in Muslim-majority contexts. And I'm sure perhaps yesterday one of the presenters already mentioned the Marrakesh Declaration, and then I don't really need to talk about it in any detail. It is interesting that the timing of the Marrakesh Declaration was such that it commemorated 1400 years of the so-called Charter of Medina, the document dating back to the time of the Prophet of Islam, that also tried to delineate the political and legal and perhaps also religious rights between different religious communities in Medina at the time of the Prophet. Yeah. So we have that initiative that is very important. But going beyond the merely legal aspects, we also have, of course, progressive Muslim voices who are going beyond the ethical pluralism in merely legal and moral terms, and they have also developed what I call an Islamic soteriology and theology of pluralism that actually finds space for non-Muslim traditions, if non-Islamic traditions, if you like, finds that they also can have salvific efficacy. In other words, that they are also legitimate pathways to the divine. Yeah. So in conclusion, what can we, based on what I've just said, presented, what kind of conclusion can we come up with? Basically, when we look at the Quran, the early Muslim community, we see that there is a large degree of contextuality and ambivalence when it comes to understanding what is the normative relationship between the Muslim self and the religious other. So it is very difficult to talk about a uniform approach. Yeah, often this has to do with how we, as interpreters of Islam, how we how we look at Islamic history, what kind of methodology of interpretation of Islamic scripture we adopt. We get different understandings and different perspectives. For example, I have provided you an example of Islamic fundamentalists and extremists who also use scripture to justify their ideas. The people, the Islamic moderates who come from a Wasatiyya approach, they were behind the Marrakesh Declaration. That goes, I think it's a very good step. It's a very good step, a step in a very good direction. But I think it is important in today's day and age to go beyond merely legal and moral and try to interpret our tradition, the Islamic tradition, in a way that allows non-Muslim traditions to be seen as valid pathways to the divine. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope this was interesting and useful.